Good morning again. So my name is Lavender Namdiro. Some of my friends call me Love, so don't feel awkward to call me Love, especially the gentlemen. That's fine. A reason I like Love because it always reminds me that that's my obligation to other human beings. So when I hear the term love, it's like I'm automatically reminded you need to love your neighbors, and you're my current neighbors. So I'm really glad to have you here. I'll be the moderator for this session. We hope to run for about 60 minutes, if it allows. And welcome all to Wakati Wetu Festival. It's really an honor to convene this critical conversation on decolonial feminism and reparative justice. It's a moment to imagine feminist futures that are rooted in collective memory, in repair and transformation. I would like to quote a very short statement by Sitawa Namwale, who I'm sure is quite well known. So she says, "We are the stories we tell. To reclaim our voices is to reclaim our power." For those in this room who think you are feminists, today we're going to learn an even deeper layer of feminists through decolonial feminism, through the brilliant panelists that I'm going to introduce right now. Decolonial feminism, it calls us to that act of reclamation, to remember and to revalue the knowledges, the solidarities and spiritualities that colonialism sought to erase. It asks us to create or to center African women's lived experiences, not as a footnote to empire, but as a source of wisdom, resistance, and renewal. So in this space right now, we honor the generations of women who have fought to name injustice and also fought to heal its wounds, reminding us that repair is not only material, but also deeply culturally, emotional, and spiritual. Our work here is to reflect together on how feminist imaginaries are rooted in history and community and how we can shape pathways towards justice and transformation. So we're joined here today by a powerful and diverse group of panelists. Each of them bring a distinct feminist lens and lived experiences to this dialogue. So allow me to introduce them. So as I introduce them, they'll come to stage. I'll begin with Nombuso Matibela. I hope I did justice to your name. Thank you. Karibu. So Nombuso is an associate of Nawi. She has worked in feminist research and created praxis, particularly using embodied and sound-based methodologies to surface marginalized voices and knowledge systems. Karibu, Nombuso. Thank you. And then we have our brilliant Omolara Oriye. Welcome. Thank you, Omolara. Karibu. Omolara is a co-dreamer with the Liberation Alliance. She is deeply engaged in movement building and consciousness raising, especially at the intersections of gender, youth activism, and collective liberation. Thank you, Omolara, for being here. We also have Dr. Lebohang Pheko. Karibu. Thank you so much. She's from South Africa, as you can tell by her vibrant dressing, okay? She brings a very strong policy and governance lens with a long-standing commitment to decolonial feminist thought, structural justice, and transformative development planning. We're really happy to have you, Dr. Pheko. Last but not least, we have Grace Namugambe from Uganda. She's representing Femnet. Grace contributes to feminist policy, analysis, and advocacy across Africa, engaging in frameworks of reparative justice, gender-responsive governance, and feminist pathways to equitable transformation. So together, they represent multiplicity and power of African feminist thought in action, from policy to activism to art to community and healing. So each of our panelists will have approximately 12 to 15 minutes to share their reflections. Afterwards, we'll be able to engage in a very convergent dialogue, and then we'll close with a round of their last thoughts on what feminist principles look going forward. So I really encourage you to engage deeply, listen generously, and think about how these insights resonate with your work and struggle. So to ground us, I invite Nombuso Matibela to begin our conversation. I believe there's a sound clip you'd like to play.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your patience. Thank you, Lavender, for moderating this session. And gratitude to everyone who is part of our panel, Grace, Mam Lebo, Omolara. It's really such a pleasure to be on this panel with you all. I think before I play the sound piece, maybe just to ground it a bit, and to ground like my own contributions. As a cultural worker, I come from a tradition of artists, cultural practitioners, body practitioners, people who work on the lenses of artistic practice and organizing. And it's a very long tradition that in my own work begins in the early 60s in South Africa. And I think it's important to ground that for you to understand where I'm coming from when I'm thinking about sound, reparations, and cultural practice. I think one of the difficulties of a reparations discussion is that we're trying to repair a past that is persisting. And we're trying to work through a particular kind of revolutionary failure and trying to repair that modality through a reparations model or through a reparations paradigm, i.e. we're trying to not only create a particular kind of future that revolution promised us, but we're trying to repair and kind of suture the past in the present, yet the past actually persists. And the question is then, what role does embodied practice and cultural work have in that? I think sound has been a very important base and method for me in thinking through what reparations then becomes for us, right? When we think about the role of music, we think about the role of like artistic practice broadly, whether you are in theater, whether you are working in visual arts, whether you're working in broadly like embodied practices where you work with your body. Really what we're trying to do is to connect the fact that the past is persisting in the present. And how do we then deal with that very specific particularity? And how do we move forward with it? And what is it that embodied practice, what is it that sound can give us a language for that words and particular ideologies cannot provide? You know, there's a kind of open space that sound is able to respond to in ways that perhaps certain ideologies or certain text work can't respond to that. So what I'm going to play is about 10 minutes. It's a clip that moves through 3 different conversations. It begins with Marikana, which is the mine worker struggle that's ongoing in South Africa. And we think of that struggle not just as a manifestation of what happens in 2013 when the democratic government betrays its own workers, black workers. But we think about that and we connect it to what happens in the 1960s, particularly 1960 in South Africa, which is the Mpondo Revolt, where essentially the generation of mine workers in 2013, their ancestors, some of them, are part of that same Mpondo Revolt that happens in 1960 against what is essentially a pushback against a particular kind of development that reparations right now is being used to project. So we begin in Marikana and then we're going to move to another connected struggle that's ongoing right now at Olobeni in the Eastern Cape. And we'll hear some of the comments from community members. And this sound piece is also merged with different musicians who are part of that lineage of the Eastern Cape. You will hear people like Johnny, who sings a song called Grandmother's Teachings, which is a song that he learns from his grandmother, a song that another really influential musician, Mary Makeba, actually sings. And then what we also hear is some conversations with people like Dorothy Mosuka, who is a very influential person in Southern African politics. She is essentially the archive to Mary Makeba, born in Zimbabwe, but living in South Africa. And then you will hear bits and pieces from other cultural practitioners in South Africa. Essentially, what I'm trying to do with the sound piece is for you to think about how artists and cultural workers and organizers and people who are fighting and struggling for land, i.e. cultural workers themselves, are thinking through what perhaps a reparatory paradigm might be, which means that could be being wayward, it could be anti-normativity, it could be queerness, i.e. we don't want your kind of development. That's what reparations is for some cultural workers in South Africa. And I think the piece is trying to drive towards that point. So we'll listen to it and then we can maybe move on, because I don't want to take up more time.
I think as we wait for her to set up, something that we can be pondering is, as we're having these conversations, we also want to know who is accountable or responsible for, sustaining cultural memory and also protecting creative practices from erasure. So by the time we're leaving this room, we're not just feeling vexed or anxious. We actually have a bit of call to actions, as my sister here spoke about yesterday. So who do we hold accountable?
were built for sinners, trying to bridge the gap between the heavens and earth. The slave ships never left. They're prettier this time round. We've built mansions with our bare hands and went home to shacks. The stars glimmer on the hip of the sky like a chrome pipe after a fresh murder. The city is an open wound. The townships are an open tomb, a bloodbath after birth. You are slave because you are black. You are black because you are slave. For centuries, white men have turned the wombs of black women into graves. It is the massacre of our existence.
You do not matter. They will slaughter your names, their tongues and acts are cutting you in pieces. Rest in peace follows you around like a haunting ghost. Or maybe not, because you have become the ghost. I can imagine it hit your spirit like a stone, paralyzed your insides, your breath on clashes, the muscles of your heart stumbling to keep everything in place. And those tears that rolled down your face uncontrollably served as a reminder that your soul and body are still one. One, they were on the floor. One, their ebony folded face, the lines on their skin dancing viciously like the Holy Bible in the hands of the poor. One, we helped them pack and were told not to cry because dark clouds would follow them. One, they were gone to be swallowed by the greedy tummy of the earth, laboring for what could have otherwise become theirs. One, neocolonialism happened, capitalism happened, anti-blackness happened, and slavery kissed them in the cheeks and shot their back when they turned. One, they were on the floor, dead. One, their lives were reduced to a hashtag on Twitter. One, they left their home to get money. Instead, they came back as corpses, leaving their loved ones in debt. One, she's gone to the same mine that killed him, and she might not make it alive like him. One, your life does not matter.
Gun,
Clack,
bullet,
shot,
black,
body, nothing to see.
Masifundiseni abantwana ingoma esifundiswa ngumama nobaba. Kubana beshova ingolova nephansi kwezontaba ubaba nomaloma.
They were putting our minds in a box. From one in the olden days, I don't know, is it grade 8 now? The South African history would get thinner and thinner and thinner. And all you were taught was that your ancestors sold the land to the white people for a mirror or a knife. But most of what we were being taught was the history of England, the Industrial Revolution, you know. We read stuff about Germany, things that we didn't relate to.
Give a very good example, which I remember. Another teacher, Teacher Mulot, would tell us, spelling the Ruta history, 1652, Maguru Lega, the capital Taro, Hudo, Waiter, the dromedaries. Yes, this history I'm teaching you is the history for examinations. They say they gave us knives. So this thing about knives is not the truth. But this is not for examination, it's for your life.
and the land, we are connected. If you separate us from the land, you're killing some part.
An Australian minerals company wants to exploit a roughly 22 kilometre by 1.5 kilometre stretch of what, honestly, is some of the most beautiful coastal areas I've ever seen. For over 20 years, you've been fighting this.
Yes.
Amazing.
Two brothers, Patrick and Mark Carusos, and they told us that they discovered the minerals. They said, I will mine a little bit in the dunes. I'm not going to disturb anybody, and also there will be a lot of jobs for locals, and I will build clinics, hospitals, better roads, clean water for this community. People, they said, no, we have livestock here. Our livestock eat the grass and drink this water that we have. And ourselves, we use these plants for healing ourselves. We depended on this. Now, are you not going to disturb all this? And people said, oh, no. It's clear that you're going to disturb our way of living, and this is not the way of development that we want. Please leave. And he left. We suspect that he went to the government. They told them, don't tell them the truth, that you're going to mine. Tell them that this is a study coming from this government, because it was recently after the democracy, and everybody, we trust the ANC. Nobody was against something that is coming from the ANC, because ANC is Mandela. There was a time where people were just saying that, is there any place where you can take us, Caruso, where we can see the livestock is still survive, the houses are still survive, the water still survive, because those are basic things that we don't want to be disturbed. It did take some of our elders to go there. He said that they were not allowed to go and meet the people that were closer to the mine. Don't go to the community. You see, the houses are good. But people said, no, that's not our intention. Our intention is to speak to the people that how did they survive next to this mine. But then instead, they just take them to the very expensive shop, the clothing shop, to buy the suits.
They were just trying to buy them, basically.
Yes. We were waiting at Komkulu for a feedback for those people they went to Richards Bay. When they come back, they tell us the truth. They said the grass is completely dry. The water, the houses, everything is falling apart. Yes, jobs is important, but we cannot compromise our livelihood just for a short term.
Singumphakathi omdala, singumphakathi osabantwana. Umhlaba wethu ubaluleke kakhulu too much. Kuba sidla wona umhlaba. Sidla wona umhlaba. Ngothatha umhlaba uphisa ubhede mandashe enkomo zophinda zibephi ezami. Yona bhangi yami yomuntu omnyama zezinkomo.
Where they want to mine is 5 villages. This village of mine, Sikiti, is one of the villages where they're going to mine. And then when we see this thing is becoming like this, we said, no, it's better to go to Komkulu.
Can you tell me about Komkulu? What's the meaning of that place?
Komkulu is a place where we discuss our local issues, like it's our traditional courts.
So Komkulu is the power in the land. It is where the decisions are made.
Abantu.
That was really deep. And I can't move to the next panelist before asking Nombuso to just share with us, the sound-based interaction that interactive piece that we've just heard. For you, how does sound and collective writing deepen? How can it help us deepen our understanding of justice, healing, and repair? When I looked up to the audience, I even saw some people had closed their eyes when they're listening to the sound. Yeah, so maybe you can just share briefly before we move to our next panelist.
Thank you, Lavender. What I forgot to mention in the beginning is the first piece that we heard was a track titled Memory is the Weapon, which is a song by Malcolm Gianni. And the title of it comes from a book that was written, if I'm not mistaken, by James Matthews, which kind of detailed the experience of apartheid in South Africa. So in many ways, what he does in that track is he kind of uplifts or extends the archive of that text, that book, into song. And I think the role that sound has is that it's able to create a new language for us to deal with experiences, conditions, realities that often words are just not enough for. And to transmute specific intergenerational sources of knowledge and ways of understanding who we are as human beings in a very culture-specific way. Because what it is to be human is so culture-specific, and sound is a base and a language to express some of those instincts, right? And I think that's the role that it has, is that it gives us a language to language repair, to language reparations, and also to confront the limitations of a reparatory framework. And collective writing also then becomes a space where we not only kind of individualize the conditions that we experience, but it becomes a space for us to actually create like a structural analysis of the personal in our lives and how it actually kind of choreographs together to form like a very deeply like diabolical structural experience of like anti-blackness or exploitation, of imperialism, and all these different formations that are really at the base of destroying any possibility of us ever becoming human, or even the earth ever having the right to be, So collective writing helps us to understand our individual capacities in this vortex of exploitation that we live in, but it also helps us to also get out of the idea that politics are resolved through individual action. And I think the merging of the two becomes very, very important, at least from a cultural lens, because it helps us to not, to reduce the conditions of exploitation to individual like priorities, but they become quite expansive, they become collective. And I think that's what actually forms and manifests this thing that we call politics. And the solutions to the kind of world that we want to see erupt out of those kinds of spaces. I think there are many examples where we've seen this, even if at the end, some of these attempts sit as failures today. The PIGC is one example of a movement that understood the role of culture in a revolutionary struggle, and in any even reparatory struggle, right? I think we even have examples in South Africa, the Black consciousness movement, the Zanzibar people's movements. These were all culturally orientated like movements. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nombuso. We give a round of applause Thank you for weaving together artistry, sound, and a feminist inquiry. I think your work reminds us that the methodology of sound and collective writing, it's on how we speak, how we listen, how we create. They're all part of how we imagine justice. So next, I'd like to move on to, or rather, I'd like to invite Omolara Oriye to bring us into the realm of critical consciousness and collective liberation. So Omolara, how does critical consciousness help reframe struggles for liberation and reparations today?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. That question makes me think of the situations in which the body is the archive, but the body is a coming together of many things, most of which, or in some cases, some of which are detrimental to the host, which is the body that holds the memory. So what kind of body produces inquiry, excavation? What kind of body is able to look at pain in the face, is able to look at complicity in the face, is able to situate itself as a site not only for individual excavation, but that looks at itself as a part of a whole, but also worthy on its own. These are kind of the questions that come to mind when I think about critical consciousness raising and how it can help us reframe the question of repair. We are in a situation where we are oppressed by systems of power, but are also simultaneously primed as oppressors within these systems, because many times we occupy multiple roles within our own subjugation. Critical consciousness invites us to awakening, not just of the body, but of the spirit. For us to be able to situate ourselves in spaces where our vision, even if it's not clear as individuals, can rely on one another within the collective. How do we come to a place where we are not seeking cosmetic repair, where we are willing to sit with the pain of recognition? And those are kind of the questions that come to mind. It's the question of how do we arrive from awareness to action, and where do we derive the patience for that journey? Where do we derive the what's the word for when you are insisting, but for a long period of time, the resilience and the persistence for that journey? And these are the questions that come to mind. I'm thinking about how do we navigate a reality that splits us in many different directions, engaging us in our own deprecation? How do we separate ourselves from a system that insists on oppressing us, but also using us as tools of perpetuating itself? How do we save our revolutionary moments from co-optation by systems of power that reinvent themselves on the back of our labor, on the back of our revolutionary inquiries? These are the questions that come to mind. When you think of movements in the past, and this movement for reparations come to mind, you find that not only do we deal with co-optation, but we prime these revolutionary moments, and then power reinvents itself on the back of this labor, which has taken many, many, many years. And then we have to kind of start from, another point, and then drive it another 50 years. And then, how do we separate ourselves from this reinvention that is done, on our backs? How do we do the work of separating what is to be repaired and what is to be destroyed? How do we come to a place of, oh yeah, reparations is amazing, but some things need to be done away with. They need to stop existing. But how do we engage our bodies in that way. So my work really intersects intellectual inquiry with sort of embodied inquiry. It's that in the age of anti-intellectualism, I work at an intersection where it's like the body is also kind of a source of information, particularly a subjugated body, a body that is politically incorrect, that is politically marginalized, that is historically marginalized. At what point does that body become trustworthy? When we think of the responsibility of silencing and co-opting liberation struggles, this is kind of a layered thing. We obviously go to the systems of patriarchy, colonial power. We go to capitalism and the ways in which we live in a state of consumerism, which a professor on YouTube calls the perfection of slavery, where we are now invested in the systems that enslave us, and dismantling it means dismantling ourselves. How do we dismantle the systems without destroying what is good about us? Epistemic disobedience. I always say that the most radical thing we can do as African women is to create, is to transmute the pain and dignity and all of the violence into creation energy, into determining the conditions of our well-being and otherwise, into determining the conditions under which we live, under which we relate with one another. Sorry, I made notes, people. These questions, they really sit with us, It is, how do we confront institutional gatekeepers? How do we confront hegemonic hierarchicization of knowledge that continues to insist that African women's knowledge is somehow inferior, that our feelings are somehow, lesser? Because the question of reparation is not just of collective repair. It is of reinstating the center of ourselves. It is both individual and collective, but the collective happens, as Bell Hooks says, on the recognition of what we are as individuals and how we fit into the collective. So how do we do that? How do we put these things forward? Epistemic violence is rife, I've mentioned that, but I truly believe that anti-colonial work is the work of creation. It is work that is achieved through sustained political, epistemic, embodied resistance. It is insisting that what I am feeling is real, what I am seeing is real. And when we think about accountability, not through the lens of critique, because as African women, we are expected to critique a system so that we are then dismissed as, noisy, loud. And, however, how do we get ahead of that? I don't even have an answer to that. I just know that the work of accounting for the indignity of these systems of power that continue to persist, and invites us to not treat the question of reparations as righting past wrongs. It is the continuous excavation, it is the continuous inquiry, the continuously carrying the past with the present, holding everything together, the contradictions, the beauty, the pain. It is the continuous work of creating and recreating as individuals, as collectives. It is a question of continuous excavation, not just, and maybe more importantly, in a way, it is kind of like an excavation through our lens. Through the work, through our own kind of accounting for the thing, and that's really what I think about, when I think about a critical consciousness lens that moves us from a place of awareness or awakening, because the journey between awareness and awakening to action, both on an individual and collective, level, is a pretty long one. But how do we hold each other in that journey? How do we divest from the notions of humanity, that of what we must look like, of what we must feel like, of how we must organize, of how we must love each other. These are kinds of the questions, because we cannot undo the colonial legacies of slavery, capitalism, and all of its evils without kind of undoing socialization in itself. And that brings us to the question of questioning normative structures. What is power, identity, love, community? We must come to the questioning of normative standards, the things that we call normal. When we wake up in the morning and have a cup of tea, why are you doing that? You know, it's really the work of regrounding. And to kind of end my 15-minute session, I wasn't looking at the time, I hope I'm still within. To end that, I always end some of my work with a confession to kind of bring us into that moment of, we have so many inquiries, but the answer really is in our bodies. The problem is not that the answers do not exist. It is that the answers exist in a system that continues to choke it, in a system that continues to postpone it. Those are in the good cases. Or the systems that continue to extract it. Because how do you account for the extraction of an aesthetic without the soul of it? You know, the appropriation of ways of being, of ways of doing things, of knowledge systems, without accounting for its origins, for its beauty, for the ways in which it's worked, for the communities that own it. How do you account for the extraction of our bodies, the extraction of our minds, of our minerals, the extraction of the things that actually make us us, and reformed in ways that turn around and call us not enough? So these are kind of the things that I'm thinking about when I think about your question. If you would come with me, I would welcome you to lower your gaze a little bit. You don't have to close your eyes. And you're going to take a big breath inward and out. And then you will say after me, regrounding in this body, in this moment, in this time, and in this space. We call forth ancestral pain, loss, glory, honor, dignity, and transmute into creation energy. We go on and live as creators, as healers, as repairers, tethered to the land, spreading beauty and vengeance. Thank you.
I made a disclaimer that we have brilliant women. Now you see. Yes? Very good. Thank you so much, Omolara. Thank you for reminding us that awareness and reflection are distinct from action and solidarity. So that thread of consciousness now brings us to the structural and institutional element. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Pheko to expound on decolonial feminist frameworks for reparative justice. So Dr. Pheko, from a decolonial feminist lens, what radical urgencies should guide reparations now? And also, who must be accountable for sustaining systems, for example, of landlessness, exploitative labor, and epistemic violence, you know, and what forms of justice can disrupt these cycles? Over to you.
Thank you. I need to do something.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. My colleagues have really welcomed and opened up this space to a very powerful energy, ancestral invocations, spiritual guidance, and it's very hard to just leap into, you know, the 5 R's of reparations off the back of that. So allow me just a second, I need to do something. Ke nna moradi wa Motsoko, moradi wa Ntshiwa, ke nna moradi wa Pheko, le moradi wa Pakisi, Balwane, Dinatla,
Ke batho ba bokgabane. Ke batho ba leng ba hore ba le balwana. Ba lwanela lefatshe. Ba robetse mona. Mpaneneng ha ba hloleha. Kore le ha ba le siyo. Ke re tsamaya le bona. Ba na le rona. Ka dinako tsa ho fela. E tlile. Ke re ho bona. Ke a le leboha ka bophelo ba lona. Ke le nna Liepollo Lebohang moradi wa Pheko. Ke a ba tshepisa hore ke santsane ke tshwere marapo a bona. Okay. I was welcoming
Dr. Pheko, sorry, yes. I think people want to clap, but they're like, hey, we're not sure what we had. If
clap,
you could.
It's okay.
Yes.
I'll translate. I needed to welcome two of the best freedom fighters that I know, who are my late parents, who traveled across countries, who were exiled from land, and who went and transitioned into glory long before what we call the restitution and the reparation of land was completed. So I'll begin by also situating myself in this conversation. My work intersects memory, the political economy, feminist economics. Apart from all the policy stuff, I've also been a Lancet Commissioner on reparations for about 7 years. For reasons that remain unbeknownst to us as commissioners, it's one of the first pieces of work that the Lancet declined to publish. You can read into that what you will. So I'm one of the 12 global scholars who have been leading this work across countries and contexts. And we have now reworked and repurposed ourselves into what is called the Walter and Patricia Commission of Reparations, and perhaps a far more fitting nomenclature than the Lancet with its vexed, complex colonial vestiges and baggage. So I'll start by saying that reparations are not a check. They are a reconstitution of our being. What in fact is being repaired? We meet at a time when repair has been turned into a bureaucratic word, as our keynote told us yesterday, quantified in aid packages, converted into policy spreadsheets, and stripped completely of its political and its spiritual depth. It is impossible to do the work and to speak of the work of repair without speaking of spirit. Now, from a decolonial feminist lens, these have to go beyond compensation. They have to reconstitute the very relations between land, between labor, between language and law. They have to heal what colonialism has dismembered, has amputated of our beings. The body from the soil, the sacred from the state, memory from governance. Reparative justice in decolonial context involves the rupturing the coloniality that's embedded within legal, political, and epistemic systems, many of which are reenactions of the violences that was imported into our bodies, into our lands, into our languages, into our sounds, into our beings. So we don't seek merely reform and checkbooks, but we do have to seek a radical transformation and a radical reclamation of the self. Land dispossession is linked to epistemic dispossession. And for me, land is my alpha and it is my omega. It is the beginning and it is indeed the end. From the dust we come and to the dust we eventually return. So land epistemic disposition which sustains colonial regimes of knowing and unknowing, governing and ungoverning, declaring those who seek to know as ungovernable, as uncivilized. And therefore, reparations mandate both land and epistemic sovereignty, restoring land rights alongside supporting indigenous and dispossessed epistemologies. Maria Lugones reminds us that colonialism invented a modern gender system, making the colonized woman the dispossessed subject of all. And Sylvia Tamali, our friend, calls this the triple colonization of body and land and labor. So when we speak of repair or reparations, there are three things I suggest initially: land and life, the right to inhabit, the right to cultivate, the right to commune as we wish. Labor and care, the economies of survival that have been erased from GDP. The economies of community, the economies of co-creation, the economies of co-living, the economies of co-being. It cannot be said that Ubuntu means I am because you are. That is an absolute grammatical error. We are because we are. And knowledge and memory, the epistemic authority to name ourselves, to narrate ourselves, to be ourselves. Now, at places like South Africa, which have their own weird colonial imprint and settler imprint, we have a month, Heritage Month or Heritage Day. Is it the 24th, 25th? Something. I'm so dislocated from it. Where people are asked to dress in their heritage. I can't stand it. That's the day you'll see me wearing jeans and a t-shirt. I refuse. Because you cannot put on yourself, adorn yourself, and then not be yourself the following day. So what are you on September the 23rd, September the 26th? What happens after that? So this whole notion of epistemic authority to be, to name, to inhabit ourselves is incredibly important. And coloniality built its empire on women's backs, says Maria Lugones, and on the silence of this earth. And this is why the invocations of those who have been is incredibly important, because their silence has to become our noise. Their vacuum has to be what we occupy, we create and embrace, and what we also must mourn and grieve in order for something else to emerge. These are not just symbolic concerns. These are ontological urgencies. They are as serious as a heart attack. I say that the restoration of land and sovereignty, recognizing land as a source of life and resistance, has to facilitate land restitutions. There's an insidious argument in many parts of this continent that says young people don't care about land. If you go to Kasarani and you see the high density, nobody can tell me that nobody cares about land. You go to places like Diepsloot in South Africa, George Compound in Lusaka, not far from where I was born. You can see that land is important. Let no media and let no elite and captured state machinery try to tell the lie and be co-opt us into our own redispossession, that this land is not important. Secondly, if we talk about decolonizing knowledge and epistemologies, then we have to challenge the epistemic violences that amplify subjugated knowledges, cultures, histories, and her stories. These have to then foster epistemic justice that recognizes the diverse, independent, sovereign, autonomous, self-existing knowledges that go far beyond Western paradigms. We are not some peripheral, cute, quaint, anthropological sideshow. We are the show. We are the production. This is the continent that has given the world everything. We cannot quantify the reparations that are owed to this continent of knowledge, of culture, of swag, just the swag here, of color, okay, of music, of knowledge of language. We don't have to go back to ancient Egypt, Pythagoras, algebra, trigonometry, although that's not a bad place to go. We don't have to go back to the fact that we gave the world paper papyrus, although that's not a bad place to go. We don't have to go back to the fact that all of your Socrates and all of the others, they sat at the feet of African people in pre-colonized Egypt. In the Egypt that looked like you and me, and not the Arab invasion and the Arab colonial complexity that we are looking at now. They sat at the feet of Nubians, Kemets, and they said, out of Africa, always something new, always something new. We don't have to go back that far. I was saying to somebody yesterday when we were coming, I was like, hey, imagine Michael Jackson's ancestors taken from us. Hey, LeBron James' ancestors taken away from us. Hey, Kendrick Lamar taken away from us. Hey, not like us, no, just like us. Just like us. So even the cultural legacy, the cultural dividend is infinite. We also have to dismantle the exploitative systems of labor. Addressing the labor practices that are rooted in coloniality requires transforming economic structures, ensuring much more equitable livelihoods, and recognizing the unpaid reproductive work that is performed by women in the majority world. I think one of the greatest reparations that could be given to Black and brown women is the reparation of that infinite time that has been taken from us. Extracted time, reproductive time, childbearing time, cleaning time, shopping time, being the woman next to the man time. All of that time. The time being shrunk and invisibilized so that some dude could feel better about themselves. Accountability. States, transnational corporations, and our fire keynote said it all. But international finance institutions that still sustain and benefit from systemic land dispossession, labor exploitation, and epistemic violence. We know that there's a cost to receiving that Amazon package in 12 hours overnight. There is labor that has been extracted and exploited. We know that there's a cost to receiving, to watching the kind of productions that we're watching on Netflix and the algorithmic flattening of what we think is consumer consumption, which is getting narrower and narrower. We also have to think about the forms of justice for disruption. Justice has to be restorative. I'm doing a bit of work on restorative economics, which I hope to publish next year. It has to be participatory, and it has to be rooted in decolonial and feminist principles, centered on the indigenous, centered on the dispossessed, and centered on redistributive justice. I also want to say a bit about critical land theory and the feminist turn, because land is the most visible wound of coloniality. Mainstream land reform that talks about the willing buyer and the willing seller, bought by who, willing by who, when we're bribed with mirrors, reduces justice to a transaction. And critical land theory refuses that reduction. It asks, what is the political, spiritual, and epistemic order that colonial land seizure created? And it also asks, what must be undone for repair to be real? It also exposes land property, which was racialized through conquest. Terra nullius, the land is empty, the bane in every settler colonial subject's existence. It reminds us that so-called post-colonial states often inherited colonial property and land regimes and then marketized them. I won't say much about Namibia. I won't say much about South Africa because it really cheeses me off. But I will say this, that it's very important that we speak about the infrastructure of survival. We have to think about the unpaid work of the women who feed and rebuild and sustain communities and who rebuild and sustain this system that continually extracts from it. We also have to think about how we redefine what is actually valuable. It cannot be just checkbooks. And I've argued for a long time that land is one of the most critical assets that can be given back, that can be taken back. And we also have to think about financial colonialism in its ongoing ontological, systemic, and economic manifestations, whether it's through the Bretton Woods and so forth. It is still feeding the system. It is obscene that one person who I shall not name goes to space in the afternoon for fun, while other people in the companies that he manages can't even take bathroom breaks. And lastly to say, hey guys, we have to restore our languages, we have to resource our healing, and we have to recognize our authority as knowers. Otherwise, these are not reparations. These just remain polite continuations of ongoing theft and deprivation and dispossession from ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Pheko. Thank you for such a deep and in-depth analysis on connecting colonial violence to feminist economies, to care, to spirituality, and also intergenerational repair. So I know I'm being told I have 2 minutes, but I still have one panelist, so I'm kindly requesting if I can be extended another 5 minutes. Thank you so much. So Grace, yes, I said 5, but in my terms, I'll ask for another 5. So it's strategic. So I'd like to hear from Grace, who will be speaking about a FemNet reparations paper. Grace, what do feminist frameworks for reparation in Africa look like? And which recommendations are most urgent? Take us through your presentation. Okay. And if you could correct, the PowerPoint. Sorry, yeah, that's her.
Okay. Thank you, Lavender, and to the very brilliant panelists. I think there was quite a lot of information in there and a regeneration of anger, and for us to keep fighting towards reparations. And just a bit on what the FemNet paper focused on when it came to reparations. In short, it explains that the call for reparations in Africa basically comes from a history of slavery, colonialism, and apartheid that inflicted deep racial and gendered harm. And that is what I would sum it up as. And in that paper, we call for a feminist approach in the design of reparations framework. And just also picking up on what the previous speakers have shared about, we say that feminist reparative framework recognizes collective and intergenerational harm. As we've had from the previous speakers, I'll just get straight into what we mean by that. That reparations must be directed not only at individuals, but at communities and generations that have been affected by the historical violence. We've seen this through the sounds that Nombuso played earlier. We also saw this for those who were in this room yesterday, the documentary on some of the artifacts that have been taken away from Africa, and how all these continue to inflict harm and harm at both at the individual level, but also sorry, I'm just trying to get my notes, and also at the generational level. And sorry about that. Yeah, and the fact that some of these harms have been passed down to grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those who were taken, for instance, into slavery. And the next is that it must center reproductive and bodily autonomy, recognizing colonial and post-colonial control over Black women's bodies as a central harm, and with reparative measures, including things like free reproductive health care, legal reforms, and cultural recognition of indigenous birthing of knowledge. And the third is around advancing land and economic justice. We've spoken about land. It is very important. And we need to, when it comes to land, we need to see the restoration of dispossessed land. And when it comes to economic justice, we need to see the cancellation of illegitimate debts, because we know that many of our African countries are currently in debt distress because of debt that was taken illegitimately by our colonial powers, but also the fact that we see that the current design of the financial architecture is meant to keep countries in debt distress, and we keep on taking debt that we might not even need, that is not managed prudently, that is still taken back to the colonizers and does not work for us, and we need that cancelled. And we also need to have a reconfiguration of trade regimes to redistribute powers and not just wealth. And that this is coming from a fact that the way the trade regime has been designed is that it keeps us at the low level of production, where we are just giving away raw materials. They are produced and brought back to us, and it keeps us in those cycles where we don't have revenue, we have to borrow, we can't produce. So a reparations framework would need to address that aspect as well. The fourth is supporting epistemic and cultural reparations. We've spoken about that. It has come out from the speakers. And in this, we're looking at, among others, funding feminist historiography and reviving indigenous languages, but also supporting community knowledge systems that were disrupted by colonialism. And in that, I would say that this would amount to restoring memory, dignity, and voice, so that African and feminist ways of knowing are respected, and that they shape our future, and that they're not erased or marginalized. And then the fifth is institutionalizing gender transformative legal reform. And we've had commitments made around gender transformative reform by governments, but we don't see this coming to being. And in this, what we're calling for is amending constitutional and customary law to recognize care work, to protect against gender-based violence, but also guarantee feminist participation when it comes to policy making. And the sixth, which is the last, is looking at redefining satisfaction and non-repetition, and that we need to go beyond apologies to ensure systemic change. We need disarmament, education reform. We need gender-just climate policy and the decolonization of institutions. And so we've had enough of the stories and we're going to do this and that keeps repeating itself. We need action now. And just to sum up the bit on the recommendations is that in this vision, we see that reparative justice becomes a radical process of truth-telling and systemic change, and it rebuilds what colonialism and patriarchy took away. It reconstructs the dignity, sovereignty, and self-determined future of African women and their communities. Just a bit in terms of who who should be taking lead, who should be held accountable. I think we all have to be held accountable, but I'll start with the global institutions, the likes of the UN, the OECD, and the likes that have continuously designed policies that take away from us. They have to play a role. The African Union being the lead when it comes to redesigning policies, but also taking steps. AU member states need to get into the implementation and the laws. Feminist movements and grassroots organizing is very critical, but also us as individuals, where do we stand in this? How do we protect our cultures? How do we emphasize things to do around knowledge, putting out the knowledge, creating it, but also making sure that our future generations keep this knowledge. And in this, I would say that it takes a coordinated ecosystem for us to implement, but also hold each other accountable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grace. Thank you so much. I mean, from the framework that you've just talked about, for me, it looks like something that can be done. I don't know what others think. Does it sound utopian, or it sounds like it can actually be implemented? So action actually needs to be done. So I'm reminded that I have 5 minutes, but I would love to hear from the audience. So would it be okay if I take up to 3 questions maximum, and then we can get a response from our panelists? So if someone would like to ask a question or a comment, so we have one hand there. I don't know who's passing the mics. Okay, we have a second question here and the third there. Thank you. Oh, sorry, let her please start. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jahira, and I'm very grateful to everybody who was speaking and acknowledging. Mostly for me, it's comments and gratitudes. Your work, the soundtrack made me think of Koleka Putuma's work, Collective Amnesia, and that was absolutely beautiful, because in collective remembering, there's something there that we don't forget. And also the fact that remembering is also how I would want us perhaps to consider naming grief, because we're not just grieving it like it's a horrible emotion, but we're remembering the things that we're doing it. And also thank you for bringing up Marikana. I don't think enough people know about what happened in 2013, and honestly, the things that continue happening across the world. And for me also thinking, I think there was a question Lara was asking about, how all those questions about what we do, how do we then imagine this world for us? And I thought of Akweke Mezi, who's a Nigerian American author, and one of their latest young adult books, Somadina, really takes people, like the reader, you'll be taken through how we can actually reimagine, how we can build these worlds together anew. And really for me, it's really appreciating and naming that. Another offering is there's FemFort Uganda, which is an organization which actually has a virtual museum of African feminist icons. So there are different ways in which I think everybody's really contributing to the work, and it's beautiful to hear about all of it as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Njahira. So maybe what I can request is we allow the questions, and then I'll give you everyone maybe a last statement to close. Over to the gentleman.
Yes, hello. My name is Daniel Olekipilosh, a cultural chief for my speaking communities in East Africa. And I'm happy to be here. What our colleague have just shared inspires. But because of time, I will say 2 things. One, reparations without talking about women probably will not be successful. The community I come from, all artifacts are made from the hands of women. And to us, artifacts are just library of information. When you have an artifact, it speaks. It also stores information such that generations can get from the artifacts. just a few years ago, we had an encounter with the Pitt Rivers Museums from the collection of artifacts they took from us. But there's these sacred artifacts. One of them was a bracelet. And this particular bracelet speaks about inheritance. Of if an old man dies, this particular bracelet will be given to the eldest son as a sign of inheritance. Inheritance in terms of responsibility, so that you take over from where I left. So when we saw this particular bracelet, it was so emotional because it reminded us that 100 plus years ago, these are the people who killed our fathers. And so whatever we expected to inherit from them, lost on the way. And so I think we need to be particular when you talk about gender in this process, because it is equally very important. And it's so unfortunate because Maasai, where I come from, women don't have say. They don't speak in front of men. In fact, one of the things that I'm doing right now as a cultural chief is to create a safe space for women to be able to speak in front of men, so that these particular high-level discussions that the cultural chiefs are undertaking, women are given a space to speak.
Thank you,
because
sir.
at the end of the day, if they don't speak, what we are lacking is spaces.
Thank you.
I had people talking about UN, General Assemblies, but our voices are not recorded there. They are telling our story. We are not telling our story. It is them. They think they know our story. They don't know our story. They are giving a hybrid kind of a story. And so what my pleading in this meeting is, how are we planning to commit ourselves so that the kind of fire that we've lit up today will not just die the following day?
Correct.
The issue of commitment is very critical, and I will urge people who are in this house to see how we can create these particular spaces that will give marginalized communities and groups, including women, to speak in those high-profile forums, to speak about their story. Because people are telling our story, and they don't know. They tell for fundraising. But for us, we'll take our genuine story from our hearts.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. So I'll allow Navina exactly 30 seconds to ask your question or what you'd like to say, and then we'll have also the panelists with 30 seconds for their last words.
I think for me, it's one of the best things I heard from the last panelist around feminist, grassroots feminist organizing. One, I would have a call to action. I wish to see the next Wakati Wetu Festival or a convening like this to have more young feminists, because if we are reclaiming memory, it means this memory is going to young people. So that's the first part. But then the second part would be to hear of reflection or best practices of how young feminist organizing from grassroots level has been happening from Femnet's work or from other panelists to carry back home and to share with other young feminists.
Thank you very much, Navina. So I'll allow our panelists each 30 seconds to just give a closing, or you'd like to respond, but we can close with your last 30 seconds. So I don't know, we start from maybe here. So over to you, Nombuso.
30 seconds.
Yes.
Okay. I think I'd like to close by maybe citing what Lavender had briefed us about, to think about a feminist principle or action that we need to move forward with. I mean, for me, I'd like to maybe borrow from queer political theory that we need to take forward into a feminist praxis, deviancy and anti-normativity that Omolara has spoken about, and waywardness, i.e., when people say they do not want development, that is a reparative principle and position. When they say that they don't want certain companies or corporations or governments interfering into their into their forms of governance communally, etc. That's a position that we should take seriously. And I think the action then becomes refusal. I think we should truly refuse to participate in any space or spaces that seek to turn reparations into a development struggle. And I think for me, this is very critical because this is a question about economic, cultural, and political and bodily sovereignty. By this, I also mean that, development struggles right now, when reparations is being used as a way of projecting a particular development struggle, i.e., we're going to use this as an avenue for aid that will control and dictate the conditions under which you actually socially reproduce a community. Right now, the development struggle of a particular kind in the early 90s has failed, and that kind of comes together with the failure of the post-colonial state. And this resurgence of a reparations debate and conversation and movement now, that's being used to kind of co-opt a particular kind of development strategy that has nothing to do with the kinds of lives and the revolutionary kind of ideas that actually preempted and manifested the reparations demands that started as early as the 1960s in the Caribbean, in South Africa, in the entire continent really, and in the United States of America, at least Black America, where these conversations of reparations were happening right next to the anti-colonial movements. So I think for us, we need to really refuse, that's an action, to refuse to participate in spaces that push a particular development agenda. Because development agenda, at the core of it, the people who suffer most in that situation, it's women and it's children. It's really where social reproduction gets completely invisibilized and destroyed when a development agenda is happening and we're not at the forefront of controlling the conditions under which it happens. In the same way that we don't control the means of production, we don't even control the conditions under which production happens. And development itself is a productive political process that we need to ensure that we are at the forefront of deciding how those conditions take place. And right now, what we're learning from the people at Xolobeni and what we've been learning for years across different agrarian movements and land struggles, which are really feminist struggles at the core of it, is that refusal and waywardness and deviancy and anti-normativity, the idea that we don't want to, is a radical position. It's a radical ethic and revolutionary ethic that is actually not lazy the way that people position it. It's not like, oh, these people don't want work, these people don't want new shops, they don't want this, they don't want that, right? So those are the positions that we need to be at the forefront of pushing against. Reparations is not simply about fixing the past, but it's determining the conditions under which we actually pursue the future.
Thank you, Nombo. So I'll move over to Omolara. Kindly, let's keep it short. Over to you.
I shall. To pick it up from where Nomboso stopped, refusing to do, but also insisting on the ways that make sense to us. The universalization of feeling, of thought, of behavior, of what is important and what is not, is absolutely something that we must reject, continue to reject. And that means rejecting, the technology that narrows our mind and narrows our gaze as well, or maybe engage critically, in that sense. I also have here that a feminist framework, an anti-colonial feminist framework of reparations will not stop at recognizing women's labor, but it also must document women's resistance, women's joys, which takes me to some work that we do at Liberation Alliance, which is archiving African women's stories of our time. We have to recognize that the work, that we are not farming in an empty field. There is the work that has been done, but what questions are incumbent upon us to answer in this generation? And how do we answer those questions so that the next generation will answer their own questions? Correct. And thereby creating a thread of kind of resistance, a thread of living in the ways that are important to us. How do we, the chief mentioned, something about committing, how do we commit ourselves? I just want to mention that women have been committing ourselves over and over and over again. I think it's important for us to know that this conversation cannot end without saying that men who occupy places of power must shift so that women can breathe. It's not enough to say, women can. We are not breathing, guys. You must get up. You must move the needle in ways that allow us space to be alive, to breathe, to contribute meaningfully, because women have been doing this in our spaces over and over and over again. And so it's incumbent upon you to use your power to shift and sometimes to leave that power, because it is inherited, from a toxic combination of the patriarchy from the colonizer and the ones that we practice here. And you must let go of those mindsets. You must let go of those spaces and actually allow African women to breathe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omolara. Thank you. Dr. Pheko?
No, I'm just exhaling. Thank you.
Oh, come on. At least just a few words from, even if it's a breathing exercise for us. That was heavy.
That was very heavy.
Yes.
I think we should then refuse these narrow definitions of repair.
Okay.
We need to reframe what justice means. We need to embody and imbibe our own forms of sovereignty. Mm-hmm. I think that we have to have feminist frameworks in our national truth-telling, truth-seeking, dismantling, reconciling, reconstruction commissions. We cannot continue in the mode that we are in at the moment. We also need to protect and to resource our creative, spiritual, ancestral practices as legitimate forms of knowledge and of self-governance. Because I think the ability to pray in our own languages, to name our own God, is one of the most important forms of reclamation. For as long as anybody, and I say this as a Christian woman, but for as long as anybody is going to impose white Jesus on me, I'd rather be called a witch.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Lastly, we have Grace.
Okay, I'll start with a question around how Femnet has been organizing at the grassroots. So we work with and through members who are within the different countries, spread across over 50 African countries, and some of them working at the grassroots, and we work with them to mobilize, especially when we have campaigns, to mobilize right from the grassroots and have women's voices heard, that we then elevate to national, regional, and global spaces. In terms of my parting shots, or the last, that I would say that when we are designing reparative frameworks, two feminist principles that I would not leave out are solidarity and intersectionality, that we need to work together, but we also need to recognize the diversities that exist across the continent and work towards ensuring that each and everyone's needs are met in this process. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nombuso, Omolara, Dr. Pheko, and Grace, for generously sharing your knowledge, experience, and feminist vision. Please all join me in a round of applause for our panelists. I would also like you guys, we all applause to our audience. It was very nice. And thank you so much for, taking the time to listen. And we hope these conversations continue even as we have lunch. So I'd like to invite everyone to Sebuleni. I hear there's a sumptuous lunch waiting for us. So shall we? We shall. Thank you very much.